Welcome to the channel. If this is your first time here, take a breath. The story you're about to hear begins with a mistake, but it isn't about fixing it. It's about what happens when you don't look away. Stay until the end. She thought she was texting her best friend about her incredibly hot new boss. One small mistake, one similar name in her contacts, and suddenly Paolo Vitale, the mysterious CEO who just became her direct supervisor, knows exactly what she thinks about him. When Camille wakes up to his response, she realizes one mistake will force her to decide who she really is before the day ends. Subscribe to see how far she'll go when everything she thought she knew about safety gets turned upside down. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Camille's Back Bay apartment, casting long shadows across her hardwood floors. She'd been in Boston for exactly 3 months, and yesterday had marked a significant shift in her career trajectory at Vitale Communications, one of the most prestigious advertising agencies on the East Coast. Camille stretched lazily, her silk pajamas shifting as she reached for her phone. The previous day's events replayed in her mind like a movie reel. Paolo Vitale himself had personally informed her that she'd be reporting directly to him now, a promotion that both thrilled and terrified her. She remembered how he'd stood in the doorway of the conference room after the team meeting, his presence commanding attention without effort. Those dark Italian eyes had found hers across the room. Camille. His voice had carried that subtle accent that made her name sound like poetry. A word, please. The memory made her stomach flutter even now. She'd approached him with professional composure, though her heart had been racing. "You'll be working directly under me from now on," he'd said, extending his business card with elegant fingers. "Save my personal number. You'll need immediate access." The way he'd said "under me" had sent an inappropriate shiver down her spine, though she was certain it was purely professional. Wasn't it? Camille rolled over, grabbing her phone from the nightstand. She needed to start her day, but first she'd check if Paul had responded to her text from last night. Her gay best friend back in Paris always gave the best advice about navigating workplace dynamics. She scrolled to find their conversation, expecting to see his typical dramatic response to her news about the gorgeous Italian boss who would now be her direct supervisor. Instead, a quiet panic settled in. The last message in the thread wasn't from Paul. It was from her. "Oh my God," she whispered, her French accent thickening with shock. But it wasn't sent to Paul. The contact name at the top of the screen read Paolo Vitale. Her message from the night before stared back at her in horrifying clarity. "Oh my God, my new boss is so hot, Italian, gorgeous, and the way he talks, girl, I'm in trouble." The phone slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor. "Merde, merde, merde," she cursed in French, scrambling to retrieve it. How could she have been so careless? Paul and Paolo, the names had looked identical when she was tired last night. She'd sent the message and gone straight to bed, not waiting for a response, because she knew Paul was probably at one of his gallery openings. Her phone buzzed with an incoming message and her heart stopped completely. Paolo. "Good morning, beautiful. I hope you slept well after such revealing thoughts." Camille stared at the screen in horror. This was it. Her career was over. She'd have to quit, move back to France, explain to her parents why she'd thrown away the opportunity of a lifetime because she couldn't properly navigate her contact list. Another message appeared. "Paolo, I trust you're ready for our 9 a.m. meeting. We have much to discuss about your enthusiasm for working under me." The double meaning wasn't lost on her. She could practically hear the amusement in his voice through the text. Camille buried her face in her pillow and screamed. 2 hours later, Camille stood outside the chrome and glass doors of Vitale Communications, her professional blazer perfectly pressed, her long dark hair pulled into a sophisticated chignon. She'd changed outfits 4 times, trying to find something that said competent professional rather than woman who sends inappropriate texts to her boss. The reflection staring back at her in the building's windows looked composed, but inside her stomach churned with anxiety. She'd rehearsed a dozen different apologies during her commute on the T, but none seemed adequate for the magnitude of her mortification. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt eternal. Each ding of the floors passing seemed to echo her impending doom. She'd even Googled how to recover from texting your boss inappropriately during breakfast, only to find unhelpful articles about drunk texting incidents that seemed amateur compared to her situation. The receptionist, a polished woman named Diana, smiled warmly. "Good morning, Camille. Mr. Vitale is expecting you. Conference room B." Of course he was expecting her. He probably had HR on standby and a termination letter already prepared. Camille's heels clicked against the marble floors as she walked through the agency's modern corridors. The walls were lined with award-winning campaign posters and sleek metal fixtures that screamed expensive taste. Everything about Vitale Communications spoke of success, precision, and power. She paused outside Conference Room B, her hand hovering over the door handle. Through the frosted glass, she could see Paolo's silhouette. Even in shadow, his presence was commanding. Taking a deep breath, she knocked softly and entered. Paolo stood with his back to her, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of Boston Harbor. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that emphasized his tall, athletic frame. His dark hair was styled with casual precision, and when he turned to face her, those penetrating brown eyes held an expression she couldn't quite read. "Camille," he said, her name rolling off his tongue like fine wine. "Right on time." "Bonjour, good morning, Mr. Vitale," she stammered, hating how her voice betrayed her nerves. A smile played at the corners of his mouth, not the professional smile she'd expected, but something more predatory, more amused. "Please, sit." He gestured to the leather chair across from where he'd been standing. Instead of taking the seat opposite her, he moved to lean against the conference table, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and intoxicating that made her thoughts scatter. "I believe you wanted to discuss something with me," he said, his voice carrying that dangerous undertone she was beginning to recognize. "Something about finding me. What was the word? Dangerous." Camille's cheeks burned crimson. Every instinct told her to apologize profusely, to explain it away as a misunderstanding. But something in his tone made her pause. He wasn't angry. If anything, he seemed entertained. "Mr. Vitale, I need to apologize. Last night I made a terrible mistake." "Did you?" he interrupted, tilting his head slightly. The movement was casual, predatory. "A mistake? Or perhaps the most honest communication we've had since you started here." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. This wasn't going how she'd imagined. Where was the cold professionalism? The stern lecture about appropriate workplace behavior? The HR meeting she'd been dreading? I don't understand," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Paolo's eyes never left hers as he spoke. "Tell me, Camille, when you wrote that message, what were you thinking about?" The question caught her completely off guard. What? "You called me dangerous for your concentration. That's quite specific." His voice dropped lower, more intimate. "What exactly were you concentrating on when you thought of me?" Paolo pushed away from the table, moving around behind her chair with predatory grace. She felt the heat of his presence as he paused directly behind her, close enough that his voice was a whisper against her ear. "You think I'm dangerous, Camille?" The way he said her name, with that Italian accent wrapping around each syllable, made her shiver involuntarily. She could feel his breath against her skin, could smell that intoxicating cologne that seemed to cloud her judgment. That's not what I meant," she whispered, though they both knew it was exactly what she'd meant. "Isn't it?" His hand appeared in her peripheral vision, fingers trailing along the edge of the conference table as he moved back into her line of sight. "You said I'm dangerous for your concentration. That suggests you've been thinking about me in ways that have nothing to do with quarterly reports and marketing strategies." The accusation hung in the air between them. Camille's breath caught in her throat. He was right, and the realization terrified her almost as much as it thrilled her. "You're reading too much into a casual comment," she said, but her voice betrayed her with its breathless quality. "Am I?" Paolo settled into the chair directly across from her now, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. Then explain to me why your pulse is racing right now. Why you haven't once asked me to step back or maintain professional distance. Why you're leaning toward me instead of away. Heat rushed through her body as she realized he was right about everything. When had she started leaning forward? When had her breathing become so shallow? "I'm not," she began, but couldn't finish the lie. Camille's breath caught in her throat. The confidence in his voice, the way he moved like he owned not just the room but everything in it, including her, was exactly what she'd found so compelling about him, and terrifying. "I think," he continued, settling into the chair directly across from her now, "that we should address this attraction directly. Don't you?" We can't." "This is highly inappropriate," she managed, though her voice lacked conviction. Paolo leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, bringing him closer to her eye level. The intensity of his gaze was almost physical. "Inappropriate," he repeated thoughtfully. "You know what's inappropriate, Camille? Pretending this electricity between us doesn't exist. Acting like professionals when we both know there's something much more primal happening here." Her heart was racing so fast she was certain he could hear it in the silence of the conference room. "You're my boss," she said weakly. "I am," he agreed, "which means I have certain influence, certain authority to structure our working relationship however I see fit." The implications hung in the air between them like a challenge. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, though part of her already knew. Paolo's smile was slow and predatory. "I'm suggesting we stop pretending, cara mia. You're attracted to me. I find you intriguing. We're both adults. We can handle this with discretion. This could destroy my career," she breathed, "or it could be the beginning of something extraordinary." He reached across the table, his fingers barely brushing hers. The contact sent electricity shooting up her arm. "You came to Boston for new experiences, didn't you? To push boundaries." He wasn't wrong. Her move to America had been about more than just her MBA and career advancement. She'd wanted to discover who she was outside the safe confines of her Parisian life. "I need to think," she said, pulling her hand back. Paolo leaned back in his chair, that confident smile never wavering. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But Camille." "Yes?" "Don't think too long. Some opportunities don't wait for us to be ready." The meeting ended with him walking her to the door, his hand on the small of her back, a touch that seemed professional, but felt anything but. As she left the conference room, her mind was spinning with confusion, attraction, and a dangerous curiosity about what accepting his proposition might mean. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of emails and client calls, but she couldn't concentrate on anything. Every time her phone buzzed, she expected another message from Paolo. Instead, she found herself constantly replaying their conversation, analyzing every word, every look, every subtle touch. By lunch, she'd made a decision. Or rather, her body had made it for her. The attraction was undeniable, and his confidence was intoxicating. But she wasn't going to make it easy for him. If Paolo Vitale wanted to play games, she'd show him that a French woman could be just as dangerous as any Italian man. She drafted a text message, deleted it, wrote another, deleted that one too. The first had been too eager, the second too defensive. She needed something that matched his energy, without giving away how much he'd affected her. Finally, she settled on something that felt right. "You're right about one thing. I don't think too long about opportunities that interest me. But I'm not as easy to impress as you might think. If you want my attention, you'll have to earn it." C. She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then immediately felt a rush of adrenaline and terror mixed together in equal measure. What had she just done? She'd essentially challenged one of Boston's most powerful men to pursue her, a man who, she was beginning to suspect, didn't hear the word no very often. Within minutes, her phone buzzed with his response. "Paolo. Challenge accepted, beautiful. Game on." The simple message sent heat spiraling through her body. There was promise in those words, and something that felt almost like a warning. As she stared at the screen, Camille realized she'd just entered into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple workplace romance. Paolo Vitale wasn't just her boss. There was something darker about him, something that spoke of power extending far beyond the advertising world. But instead of scaring her away, that mystery only made him more intriguing. The afternoon flew by in a haze of anticipation and nervous energy. Every email, every passing colleague, every phone call felt like it might be connected to whatever Paolo was planning. The man had promised to earn her attention, and something told her he wasn't the type to make idle threats. As 5 o'clock approached, Camille began packing up her things, wondering if the day would end anticlimactically. Maybe she'd overestimated his interest. Maybe... "Ms. Bethencourt," Diana's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Mr. Vitale asked me to give you this." The receptionist handed her an elegant envelope with her name written in what was unmistakably Paolo's handwriting. Strong, confident strokes that somehow managed to look both professional and intimately personal. Inside was a simple black card with gold embossing. "Dinner 8 o'clock, Mistral. The table is reserved under your name. Come if you're ready to stop playing it safe. P." Camille stared at the card, her pulse quickening. Mistral was one of Boston's most exclusive restaurants, the kind of place that required reservations weeks in advance. The kind of place that spoke of serious money and serious connections. She glanced at her watch. It was already past 5:30. If she was going to do this, she needed to go home and change. But more importantly, she needed to decide if she was brave enough to find out exactly who Paolo Vitale really was. The smart thing would be to text him a polite decline, to maintain professional boundaries and protect her career. But as she looked around the sleek offices of Vitale Communications, at the expensive art and the view of Boston Harbor, she realized that playing it safe had never gotten her anywhere this exciting. Her phone buzzed with one final message. "Paolo. The car will pick you up at 7:30. Wear something that shows you're not afraid of a little danger." Camille felt a thrill run through her as she realized she'd made her choice without even consciously deciding. Tonight, she would discover exactly what kind of game Paolo Vitale wanted to play, and she intended to win. The Blacktown car that arrived at exactly 7:30 p.m. was everything Camille had expected. Sleek, expensive, and mysteriously tinted. What she hadn't expected was the driver, a man built like a linebacker who introduced himself simply as Tony and treated her with the kind of respectful deference usually reserved for royalty. Camille had chosen a deep burgundy dress that hugged her curves without being overtly sexual, paired with heels that gave her confidence and a leather jacket that suggested she wasn't easily intimidated. Her reflection in the car's window showed a woman who looked ready for whatever the evening might bring. "First time to Mistral, miss?" Tony asked as they glided through Boston's evening traffic. "Yes," she replied, watching the city lights blur past. "You'll like it. Mr. Vitale has excellent taste." There was something in the way Tony said it that made Camille wonder exactly how well he knew Paolo. The familiarity suggested a relationship that went beyond typical employer-driver dynamics. Mistral occupied a corner building in the South End, its elegant facade promising the kind of dining experience that appeared in lifestyle magazines. As Tony held the car door open for her, Camille felt a flutter of nerves mixed with anticipation. "He's waiting for you," Tony said with what might have been the hint of a smile. The maître d' greeted her by name before she'd even reached the podium. "Ms. Bethencourt, welcome to Mistral. Mr. Vitale is at your table." He led her through the dimly lit restaurant, past tables occupied by Boston's elite. She recognized a city councilman, a tech CEO, whose face regularly appeared in Forbes, and what appeared to be a federal judge. This wasn't just an expensive restaurant. It was a place where power brokers came to conduct business away from prying eyes. Paolo rose as she approached their table, which was positioned in a private corner with a clear view of the entire restaurant, but shielded from casual observation. He'd changed from his business suit into dark jeans and a black button-down that somehow managed to look both casual and impossibly expensive. "You came," he said, moving around the table to pull out her chair. "I'm here," she replied, allowing him to seat her while trying to ignore how his fingers brushed her shoulders as he adjusted her chair. "And you look stunning," he added, settling across from her. "Though I have to admit, I wasn't sure you would show. Camille lifted her chin slightly. You said you had excellent taste. I wanted to see if you were right. His laugh was rich and genuine. Direct. I like that. A server appeared immediately with a bottle of wine that Paolo must have pre-selected. As the sommelier went through the tasting ritual, Camille took the opportunity to study Paolo in this different setting. Away from the corporate environment, he seemed more relaxed but somehow more dangerous. The Polish was still there, but underneath it was something rawer, more elemental. So, she said once they were alone again, is this how you typically handle HR issues? Is that what this is? Paolo asked, swirling his wine. An HR issue? You tell me. You're the one who invited your employee to dinner at one of Boston's most exclusive restaurants. You're not just an employee, Camille. You haven't been since the moment you walked into that conference room 3 months ago. The directness of his statement caught her off guard. What do you mean? Paolo leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes fixed on hers. The intensity of his gaze was almost physical, like he could see straight through every defense she'd ever constructed. I mean, I've been watching you. The way you handle clients, the creative insights you bring to campaigns, how you command a room without even realizing it. You have something most people in this business lack, which is authenticity. You don't play games, at least you didn't until today. His lips curved into what might have been a smile, but felt more dangerous than amusing. But more than that, you have fire. Most people who work for me are either trying to impress me or they're afraid of me. You do neither. Camille felt her pulse quicken. Maybe you just haven't given me reason to be afraid yet. Haven't I? The question was soft, loaded with implication. You're here, aren't you? Despite every rational thought telling you this is a terrible idea. That suggests either incredible bravery or a complete lack of survival instincts. Which do you think it is? Paolo's smile was slow and predatory. I think you're discovering that the two aren't mutually exclusive. The waiter appeared to refresh their wine, but Camille barely noticed. She was completely focused on Paolo, on the way his eyes seemed to catalogue every micro-expression that crossed her face. You're very good at deflecting, she observed, once they were alone again. Am I? I asked you what you wanted from me. You turned it into an analysis of my personality. Maybe because what I want from you isn't simple. Paolo set down his wine glass with deliberate precision. Most people want uncomplicated things, safety, predictability, a clear understanding of where they stand. And you don't? I want complexity, Camille. I want a woman who challenges me, who doesn't bore me after the first conversation, someone who can match my intensity without being consumed by it. Camille felt heat rise in her cheeks. About that text message. Was the truth, he interrupted. Don't apologize for honesty, Cara. It's refreshing. The endearment rolled off his tongue so naturally that she almost missed it. Almost. You keep calling me that, she observed. Cara? It means dear in Italian. Does it bother you? It's unprofessional. So, is having dinner with your boss? So is the way you're looking at me right now. Sometimes the most interesting things happen outside the boundaries of what's considered appropriate. Their food arrived, dishes she hadn't remembered ordering, suggesting Paolo had pre-planned more than just the wine. Everything was perfectly prepared, expertly plated and completely beside the point. The real feast was this conversation, this dance of words and intentions. Tell me about yourself, Paolo said, cutting into his steak with precise movements. Beyond the resume I already know by heart. What do you want to know? Everything. Why did you really come to Boston? What are you running from in Paris? The question was casual, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. Who says I'm running from anything? Everyone who moves halfway across the world is running from something, or towards something. Which is it? Camille considered deflecting, but something about his intensity made her want to match it with honesty. Maybe both. Paris felt suffocating, too small, too predictable. I wanted to see who I could become somewhere no one knew my history. And who are you becoming? I'm still figuring that out. Paolo smiled, and there was something almost predatory about it. I could help with that exploration. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to that intimate register. I hope you don't plan on returning to France, Cara. That's not your place anymore. Your place is here now. The possessiveness in his statement was unmistakable, and it sent a thrill through her that she couldn't quite suppress. Is that what tonight is? A career counseling session? Tonight is whatever you want it to be, Camille. But don't pretend you don't feel this. He gestured between them. This electricity. This pull. She did feel it, a magnetic attraction that had nothing to do with professional admiration and everything to do with the way he looked at her like she was a puzzle he was determined to solve. You're very confident, she observed. Confidence comes from knowing what you want and having the power to get it. And what do you want? Paolo's smile was slow and dangerous. Right now? I want to know what you taste like. The words hung in the air between them, bold and unapologetic. Camille felt her pulse quicken, heat pooling low in her stomach despite her attempts to maintain composure. You can't just say things like that, she managed. Why not? It's what I'm thinking, what you're thinking too, if you're honest. You don't know what I'm thinking, don't I? Paolo leaned back in his chair, studying her with those dark eyes. You're thinking about what would happen if you stopped fighting this attraction. You're wondering what it would feel like to let someone like me take control. And you're scared because you've never wanted someone who could be genuinely dangerous for you. Each word hit like a physical touch. He was reading her so accurately it was almost frightening. Dangerous how? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Paolo's smile didn't reach his eyes. There are different kinds of danger, Cara, some more obvious than others. Before she could ask what he meant, his phone buzzed against the table. He glanced at it and something shifted in his expression, a hardening that transformed him from charming dinner companion to something else entirely. Excuse me, he said, standing. I need to take this. He stepped away from the table, moving toward the restaurant's entrance with that same predatory grace she'd noticed earlier. Even from across the room, she could see the tension in his shoulders as he spoke into the phone. Camille used the opportunity to study the other diners more carefully. Now that she was paying attention, she noticed things that hadn't registered before. The way certain servers moved with military precision, how several of the other patrons seemed more interested in watching the room than enjoying their meals. The subtle attention to detail that suggested this wasn't just a restaurant. It was a carefully orchestrated environment. When Paolo returned, his easy charm was back in place, but she could sense the tension underneath it. Everything all right? She asked. Just business. Nothing that can't wait until tomorrow. But his eyes said otherwise. What kind of business requires attention at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night? Paolo's pause was almost imperceptible. The kind that never sleeps in this city. Boston might seem provincial compared to New York, but there's more happening here than most people realize. It wasn't really an answer, and they both knew it. You're being deliberately vague, she observed, and you're being deliberately curious about things that might be better left unexplored. The shift in his tone was subtle, but unmistakable. Not quite a warning, but close. Instead of backing down, Camille felt her own spine straighten. Everything about you fascinates me now, doesn't it? If we're going to... whatever this is we're doing. Paolo studied her for a long moment, and she had the distinct impression she was being evaluated against some internal criteria she couldn't begin to understand. You're not what I expected, he said finally. What did you expect? Someone easier to discourage. The admission sent a thrill through her, dangerous and intoxicating. Sorry to disappoint. Oh, Cara, Paolo's voice dropped to that low register that made her pulse race. You're not disappointing me at all. You're exceeding every expectation. Their server appeared with dessert neither of them had ordered, a chocolate creation that looked more like art than food. But Paolo waved it away with a subtle gesture. We'll take the check, he said, without taking his eyes off Camille. The evening's over already, she asked, though she could feel the shift in energy between them. The dinner portion is over, Paolo replied, signaling for their waiter. What happens next depends on how brave you're feeling. Brave enough, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Paolo's smile was pure heat. We'll see. The ride back to her apartment was charged with tension. Paolo sat close enough that she could feel his warmth, but he didn't touch her. The restraint was almost more intoxicating than contact would have been. "You live alone?" he asked as Tony navigated the late evening traffic. "Yes." "Good." The single word carried enough implication to make her breath catch. When they pulled up outside her building, Paolo walked her to the door like a perfect gentleman, but there was nothing gentlemanly about the way he looked at her. "Thank you for dinner," she said, suddenly uncertain how this evening was supposed to end. "Thank you for coming, for being exactly as intriguing as I hoped you'd be." He stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "Camille," he said, her name a caress on his lips. "Yes?" Instead of answering, he reached up to cup her face, his thumb tracing along her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. The touch was electric, making every nerve ending in her body come alive. "I'm going to kiss you now," he said, giving her time to object. She didn't. When his lips met hers, it was nothing like she'd imagined. She'd expected dominance, possession, something that matched the dangerous energy she sensed in him. Instead, he kissed her with a restraint that was somehow more powerful than force would have been. His lips moved against hers with practiced expertise, coaxing rather than demanding. One hand remained on her face, while the other settled at the small of her back, pulling her closer without being aggressive about it. She could taste wine on his tongue, could feel the controlled strength in the way he held her. When she responded, rising on her toes to deepen the contact, she felt more than heard his sharp intake of breath. The sound sent heat spiraling through her body, and for a moment she forgot where they were, forgot about propriety and consequences and everything except the way he made her feel completely alive. The kiss lasted exactly long enough to leave her wanting more before he pulled back, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare. "Ben," he murmured, his accent thicker than usual, his thumb tracing her lower lip with devastating gentleness. "Now I know." "Know what?" she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "That you taste even better than I imagined," he said, stepping back with visible effort, "and that you're going to be even more dangerous for my concentration than I am for yours." "Sweet dreams, cara mia," he said, his accent thicker than usual. Then he was gone, leaving her standing on her doorstep with swollen lips and a racing heart, watching Tony's car disappear into the Boston night. Inside her apartment, Camille leaned against her closed door and tried to process what had just happened. The evening had been a carefully orchestrated seduction, but she'd been an active participant rather than a passive victim. The realization was both empowering and terrifying. Her phone buzzed with a text message. "Paolo. Tonight was just the beginning. Sleep well, knowing I'm thinking about you." She stared at the message, her body still humming with attraction and adrenaline. Whatever game Paolo was playing, she was already in too deep to back out now. But as she prepared for bed, Camille couldn't shake the feeling that there were layers to Paolo Vitale she hadn't even begun to discover. The mysterious phone call, the way the restaurant staff had treated him, the subtle atmosphere of controlled power that seemed to follow him everywhere. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay closer attention. If Paolo wanted to play games, she needed to understand exactly what kind of game they were playing. Her last thought before falling asleep was wondering if she was brave enough to handle the truth about the man who had just kissed her like she was something precious and dangerous all at once. The next morning brought a revelation that changed everything. Camille had arrived at work early, determined to maintain some semblance of professionalism despite the previous evening's developments. She'd dressed carefully, a navy blazer and pencil skirt that projected competence while still feeling feminine enough to remind Paolo of what he'd tasted last night. But her carefully constructed composure crumbled the moment she opened her laptop. An email from her friend Paul in Paris was waiting, sent in the early hours of the morning Paris time. The subject line read, "Emergency, about your boss. Chérie, I hope this reaches you before you do something you might regret. I was talking to my cousin who works in international finance, and when I mentioned your Italian boss's name, he went completely pale. Camille, I don't know how to tell you this gently, so I'll be direct. Paolo Vitale isn't just some advertising executive. His family, they have a reputation. The kind of reputation that makes headlines in very specific circles that have nothing to do with quarterly reports. Please be careful. Some men are dangerous in ways that go far beyond breaking hearts. Call me. Pay. Attached was a link to an Italian business journal from 3 years ago. Even with her limited Italian, Camille could understand enough to make her stomach turn cold. The article detailed various high-profile business acquisitions and partnerships across several European cities. The Vitale name appeared multiple times, always in connection with unofficial influence and private networks that don't appear on paper. There were no direct accusations, no explicit details, but the implications were crystal clear. Paolo's business empire extended far beyond advertising brilliance. Camille stared at her computer screen, her mind reeling. The mysterious phone call at dinner, the way the restaurant staff had treated him, Tony the driver who seemed more like personal security, it all suddenly made perfect sense. Her phone buzzed with a text from Paolo. Paolo. Good morning, beautiful. I trust you slept as poorly as I did, though for much more pleasant reasons. The casual intimacy that had thrilled her 12 hours ago now felt loaded with new meaning. She was staring at the message, trying to formulate a response, when her office door opened without a knock. Paolo stood in the doorway looking devastatingly handsome in a perfectly tailored black suit. But now, instead of seeing sophisticated elegance, Camille saw something more calculated in the way he moved, something deliberate in his smile. Buongiorno, cara, he said, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded unnaturally loud in the suddenly tense atmosphere. Good morning, she managed, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. He approached her desk with that same fluid grace she'd found so attractive, but now it reminded her of how apex predators moved. Beautiful, mesmerizing, and absolutely lethal. You seem tense this morning, he observed, settling into the chair across from her desk. Something troubling you? Camille's mouth felt dry. Did he know she'd discovered his secret? Was this a test? Just processing last night, she said carefully. Paolo's dark eyes studied her with an intensity that made her feel completely exposed. And what conclusions have you reached? The question was casual, but there was steel underneath it. Not quite a warning, but close. That you're not exactly who I thought you were, she said, surprising herself with her honesty. Paolo's smile was slow and dangerous. No, cara mia, I'm exactly who you thought I was. You're just finally allowing yourself to see it clearly. He stood and moved around her desk, his presence overwhelming in the small space. When he was directly behind her chair, he placed his hands on her shoulders, a gesture that could appear protective to any outside observer, but felt like a claim of ownership. Tell me, his voice was low, meant only for her ears, what exactly do you think you've discovered? Camille's pulse was racing, but something inside her, the same stubborn streak that had brought her to Boston in the first place, refused to be intimidated. I think, she said, turning in her chair to face him, that your influence extends beyond advertising. I think that phone call last night had nothing to do with quarterly reports, and I think you're giving me a chance to pretend I haven't figured that out. Instead of the anger or denial she'd expected, Paolo laughed, a rich, genuinely amused sound that was somehow more unsettling than threats would have been. Brava, he said, stepping back and perching on the edge of her desk. I wondered how long it would take you to start asking the right questions. You're not denying it. Would there be any point? You're clearly intelligent enough to have done your research. The only question now is what you intend to do with your newfound knowledge. Camille stared at him, off balance by his casual admission. She'd expected denials, deflection, maybe even anger. Instead, he seemed almost relieved. You could have lied. I could have. But lies are exhausting, and I find you far too interesting to insult with deception. He leaned forward slightly, close enough that she could see the golden flecks in his dark eyes. Besides, Cara, would you really want a man who was entirely safe? The question hit her like a physical blow, because the answer, horrifyingly, was no. Even knowing what she now knew, even understanding that Paolo represented a kind of danger she'd never encountered before, She was still drawn to him like a moth to flame. "This is insane," she whispered. "Is it? Or is it the first real thing that's happened to you since you arrived in Boston?" Paolo's voice dropped to that low register that seemed to bypass her brain and speak directly to her body. "Tell me honestly, Camille, when was the last time you felt truly alive? When was the last time something made your heart race not from fear, but from excitement?" She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. Because he was right. Her life in Paris had been safe, predictable, comfortable. Even her move to Boston had been calculated, planned, risk-managed. But sitting across from Paolo, knowing what he was capable of, she felt more awake than she had in years. "You don't know anything about what I want," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Don't I?" Paolo's smile was knowing, almost predatory. "I think I know exactly what you want, cara mia. You want to be seen. Really seen. Not as the competent French girl who follows all the rules and never causes problems. You want someone who can handle the real you, the one who sends inappropriate texts about her boss and then has the courage to show up the next day anyway." Before she could respond, he stood and moved toward the door. "Lunch," he said without turning around. 1 o'clock, I'll send a car." "Paolo, wait." He paused with his hand on the doorknob. "Yes? What if I say no?" He turned back to face her, and for a moment his mask slipped entirely. What she saw underneath was raw hunger and something that looked almost like vulnerability. "Then you say no," he said simply. "I don't compel anyone, Camille. Whatever else you might think of me, remember that." After he left, Camille sat in her office trying to make sense of what had just happened. Paolo had essentially confirmed that he was involved in something that operated outside normal business channels. Any rational person would distance themselves immediately, or at the very least request a transfer to another department. Instead, she found herself counting the minutes until 1 o'clock. The car that picked her up wasn't Tony's town car, but a sleek BMW with tinted windows. The driver introduced himself as Marco and treated her with the same respectful deference she'd noticed the night before. They drove through Boston's North End, past the Italian restaurants and historic sites that made this neighborhood a tourist destination. But Marco turned down progressively smaller streets until they reached a narrow alley that most people would never notice. "We're here," Marco announced, pulling up in front of what appeared to be an unmarked door in a brick building. "Here where?" Camille asked, but Marco was already out of the car, holding her door open. The unmarked door led to a staircase that rose toward what looked like a private restaurant. The space was elegant but intimate, with exposed brick walls lined with wine bottles and only a handful of tables. Every table was empty, except one. Paolo sat in the corner, his back to the wall and a clear view of both the entrance and the windows. He'd changed from his business suit into dark jeans and a charcoal sweater that made him look younger, but no less dangerous. "This is beautiful," Camille said as she approached the table. "What is this place?" "Somewhere we can talk without interruption," Paolo replied, standing to pull out her chair. "My family has owned it for 15 years. Family. The word carried weight now that she understood what kind of family business the Vitales were involved in. A server appeared immediately with wine and what appeared to be a pre-selected meal. The efficiency suggested this was Paolo's usual routine, bringing people here when he needed privacy for sensitive conversations. "How many women have you brought here?" she asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. Paolo's eyebrows rose. "None." "I don't believe you. I don't care what you believe about my past relationships, Camille. I care about this moment, this conversation, and what happens between us moving forward." He poured wine for both of them, his movements precise and controlled. Everything about Paolo was controlled, she was beginning to realize. The casual charm, the seductive confidence, it was all carefully calculated. "Why me?" she asked. "You could have anyone. Why risk getting involved with someone who works for you?" "Because," Paolo said, meeting her eyes directly, "you're the first woman I've met who might actually be worth the risk. I'm not that special. You're here, aren't you? Despite knowing what you know, despite every rational instinct telling you to walk away, you're sitting across from me asking questions instead of running to the nearest exit." He was right, and they both knew it. The smart thing, the safe thing, would have been to never get in that car, but here she was, drawn by something stronger than self-preservation. "I want to understand," she said, "who you really are, what you really do." Paolo considered this, swirling his wine thoughtfully. "What I really do is manage various business interests across multiple cities. Some of those businesses operate within traditional frameworks. Others require more creative approaches." "How creative?" "Creative enough to require discretion. Creative enough to make relationships complicated." "Complicated how?" "Because, cara mia," Paolo leaned forward, his voice dropping to that low register that made her pulse race, "people in my position can't afford to trust easily. We can't afford to show weakness. And caring about someone, really caring, is the ultimate vulnerability." The admission hung between them, raw and honest in a way that took her breath away. "Then why risk it?" she asked. "Because some risks are worth taking. Because I've spent 32 years being careful, being calculating, being exactly what the situation required. And then you walked into my conference room with your French accent and your complete inability to pretend to be anything other than exactly who you are, and for the first time in my adult life, I wanted something for purely selfish reasons." Camille felt heat rise in her chest at his words. "What do you want from me, Paolo?" "Everything," he said without hesitation. "Your trust, your loyalty, your secrets, everything you have to give. And in return," Paolo's smile was pure heat, "protection, pleasure, access to a world most people never see, and the knowledge that you belong to me, completely, exclusively, irrevocably." The possessiveness in his voice should have terrified her. Instead, it sent liquid fire through her veins. "That's quite an offer," she managed. "It's not an offer, Cara. It's a promise. The question is whether you're brave enough to accept it." Before she could respond, Paolo's phone buzzed against the table. He glanced at it, and that familiar tension returned to his shoulders. "I need to take this," he said, standing. "Don't go anywhere." He moved to the far side of the restaurant, speaking in rapid Italian that Camille couldn't follow. But his body language was clear. Something required immediate attention. When he returned, his expression was carefully neutral, but she could sense the shift in energy radiating from him. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing that concerns you yet." He resumed his seat, but the relaxed intimacy of moments before was gone. "But it does mean our lunch is going to be shorter than planned." "Business? The kind that requires immediate attention," Paolo signaled to the server, who appeared instantly with their check. "Marco will take you back to the office." He was already standing, transforming back into the controlled, calculating man she'd first met. But as he moved around the table, he paused next to her chair. "Camille," he said, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder, "what we discussed here today, about my business, about what I want from you, stays between us, completely. Do you understand?" There was no mistaking the intensity in his voice. This wasn't a request. "I understand," she said. "Good." He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "Because I don't share what matters to me." The ride back to the office was tense, with Marco making several phone calls in Italian and taking a route that seemed unnecessarily complex. When they finally arrived at the Vitale Communications building, Camille noticed additional security in the lobby, men in expensive suits who watched her with professional interest. Back in her office, she tried to focus on work, but her mind kept returning to Paolo's words. "I don't share what matters to me." The implication was clear. He already considered her his, regardless of whether she'd officially agreed to anything. Her phone buzzed with a text. "Paolo. Something has come up that requires my attention for the next few days. Don't do anything foolish while I'm handling it. We'll continue our conversation when I return." The message was followed immediately by another. "Paolo. And Camille. Sweet dreams. I'll be thinking about you even when I'm taking care of business." She stared at the messages, understanding that she'd reached a crossroads. Paolo would be away on mysterious business for several days. This was her opportunity to walk away, to transfer to another department, or even request a position in another city. to choose safety over whatever dangerous game they'd been playing. The office had grown quiet around her. Through her window she could see people heading home, returning to their normal, predictable lives. Lives where the most dangerous thing they'd encounter was deciding whether to order Thai food or pizza for dinner. She could be one of them. She could still walk out. Her finger hovered over her phone screen. She could delete his number, block it entirely, draft an email to HR requesting a transfer. Pretend this day had never happened, that she'd never felt the electric thrill of his attention or the dangerous promise in his voice when he said her name. The smart choice was obvious. The safe choice was right there waiting for her to take it. Instead, she found herself typing, "Be safe. I'll be here when you get back." But as her finger moved toward send, she stopped. Why was she responding on his timeline? Why was she reassuring him when he was the one who'd turned her entire world upside down in the space of 3 days? She didn't need to wait for his return, didn't need to react to his messages or play by his rules. She deleted the draft message. Then she did something that surprised even herself. She gathered her things, turned off her computer and walked out of the office. Not to run away, not to escape what had happened, but because she'd made her choice. And it wasn't about responding to his texts or waiting for his next move. It was about showing up tomorrow, and the day after that, and seeing exactly how far this dangerous territory would take her. On her terms. As she walked through the lobby, past the additional security that now made perfect sense, Camille felt something settle inside her chest. Not fear, not recklessness, but certainty. She'd spent her entire life making careful decisions, weighing consequences, choosing the path that made the most sense. Paris had been safe. Her MBA program had been practical. Even her move to Boston had been calculated to advance her career in measurable ways. But Paolo Vitale represented something else entirely. He represented the kind of choice that couldn't be rationalized or justified or explained to anyone else. The kind of choice that was pure instinct, pure want. She didn't answer Paolo's messages that night. She didn't need to. Tomorrow, she would walk into that office building with her chin up and her shoulders back. She would meet whatever challenges he'd arranged for her. She would show him that choosing danger didn't mean surrendering control. Her presence when he returned would be answer enough. And if that meant stepping into a world where power operated by different rules, where influence moved through channels she was only beginning to understand, where a single wrong move could change everything, well, maybe it was time she stopped playing it safe. Nothing had forced her. That was the most dangerous part. If you stayed until the end, you already understand her choice. Tell me, would you have made the same one?